Good evening, everyone. This is Antonio Andreoni. I'm an associate professor here at IPP, and I'm also convening this seminar series. This is the fourth event for this term, and tonight we are particularly pleased to have Professor Rasmus Lema from Aalborg University, who is going to give a talk on a topic which is, of course, very, very relevant and very hot at the moment, given the not just the climate, but also the COP26, which has just completed. Rasmus has worked extensively on green transition and green windows of opportunities across, in particular, Africa, and has done lots of work on sustainable transition also in the global context and the intersection between China and the role of China in investment also in the African continent. And he's collaborated with a number of scholars who have been looking also at other regional areas across the global south. I would like just to emphasize his recent edited volume, Building Innovation Capabilities for Sustainable Industrialization, Renewable Electrification in Developing Economies, which is, I understand, published by Routledge and is just out for anyone interested. Rasmus will engage us tonight in this topic. I must say also, Rasmus has a long-standing affiliation with Globerics and the broader innovation and development community, where he also is one of the editors of the journal, and he's also a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, where he works with also colleagues who are also affiliated at IPP, like Erika Kammenbühle, who gave a talk just last year with us here. So great to have you here, Rasmus, and great to have the chance to engage with you as part of this extended network. For tonight, as usual, we will have the 40 minutes presentation, followed by a structured set of comments from Kino Averkamp. Kino is one of our PhD students here at IPP and is himself working on this topic. So will give us an insider, the research perspective on what Rasmus will talk about. I recognize a few names here among the people in the audience, so I'm sure we are going to have a very rich discussion. Without further ado, Rasmus, the floor is yours, and thanks again for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Let me bring up the slides. You see them, right? Yeah. Okay. So, once again, thank you very much to Antonio and the department for organizing this. It's a great pleasure, I think, to talk in this setting on some research that I've been working on over quite a number of years. Obviously, it's me presenting today on green windows of opportunity, latecomer development in the age of transformation towards sustainability. But although it's me who's presenting, this is really a collective work. So I'm talking about work that was put together in a special issue, and the editors, along with myself, was Xiaolong Fu from Oxford University and Roberto Ravalotti of the University of Pavia. But it was also a collaborative effort in a wider sense, because we worked together with a number of experts on renewable energy industries in China and globally. So researchers from Europe and researchers from China, and we were very much supported by my own university and an organization called the Sino-Danish Center for Education and Research, which is based in Beijing and then hosted us for a number of meetings and so on. So thanks to a lot of individuals and institutions, I can present here what we did in the special issue. Of course, what I can do in 30 to 40 minutes is to present some of the key ideas, the framing, and the main findings, and I hope to leave some time for an interesting discussion afterwards. So now here it is. Okay. So obviously, for this research, the background, of course, is, as we all know, as Antonio mentioned, a very hot topic, big issue of our times. The green transformation of the global economy is underway. It entails a lot of things. It entails shifting discourses, changing national policy priorities, new parameters of investment decisions, business models and strategies, and so on. And these trends are accelerating, becoming much more important, not less over time. So what this amounts to is really a major techno-economic paradigm shift. Earlier paradigm shifts have been driven by technologies and markets. This green transformation is driven to a large extent by policies. Of course, also earlier transformations have been also driven to some extent by policy-induced changes. But I think this one is different in the weight and the dynamism arising from that. And of course, then we are asking a very big question, which is about what does it all mean for sort of latecomer development and catching up in emerging economies. It's still uncertain to what extent the green transformation, whether it increases entry barriers, making latecomer development more difficult, or whether it opens up windows of opportunity. And this is basically what we wanted to look into. It's a very interesting question also in terms of how discourses are changing. Around the COP and elsewhere, there are a lot of discussions about responsibilities for climate change mitigation and so on, and rhetoric about climate change mitigation being a cost. Despite that rhetoric, there's also, I think, increasing agreement underneath that and increasing recognition that there are indeed a lot of opportunities involved in this. So it's interesting both from a policy and from a conceptual perspective around issues of catching up. So this big question can be decomposed into some more specific question. So to what extent is the green transformation opening up new development opportunities for latecomer development? Still a big question. What are the conditions and dynamics of green latecomer development in this context? And do we need a new conceptual framework to understand the determinants of change in green industry leadership? So looking into this last question about the theoretical framework, we of course looked into the established literature, or I should say a section of the established literature on catching up as it relates to techno-economic paradigm changes and windows of opportunity. This kind of framing can be traced back in particular to a paper by Carlota Perez and Luc Soete in 1998, where they introduced this notion of windows of opportunity that are arising as technologies change, in particular when you have disruptive technological changes. What such changes can mean is that some of the incumbents in terms of their competitive advantages, these competitive advantages may be reduced. Some of their knowledge bases, their routines and practices may become obsolete as technologies change. Newcomers, on the other hand, can have, in certain conditions, more freedom to move. They can be more nimble in such times of uncertainty, less vested in established routine, and therefore there may be opportunities for leapfrogging. This is the idea. And in framing this, we've built in particular on this recent research by Kyun Lee and Franco Malerba, where they discuss windows of opportunity and changes in industrial leadership in a range of industries, mainly in manufacturing and some heavy industries. And they provide a lot of examples about how disruptive changes in technology provide such opportunities, and they discuss the dynamisms of exploiting these opportunities. So, for instance, a good example is this: the shift from flat screen TV, from old bulky TVs to flat screen TVs, and how South Korea was able to move in on this changing technology and gain increasing market shares and learning opportunities and so on. Also, in terms of disruptive market changes, one example from that work is the case of Chile in wine, and how this expansion of mass markets created opportunities for Chile. So in this literature, although of course the importance of institutional and policy changes are recognized, most of it has been focused on technological changes. So this is another reason why we think it's quite interesting, and for this case very useful to look much deeper into sort of more institutional driven windows of opportunity. So we try to put together a new kind of drawing, of course, on some of this literature. We try to put together a new framework. The background or the point of departure for this framework, of course, is that the case we're talking about is disruptive in many ways. And by per definition, the green transformation is exactly about doing things differently. And it's quite essential for emerging economies and the economies at large, of course, to deviate from established pathways of North America and Western Europe. So a kind of imitation strategy, per definition, is not going to work and cannot work in this context. So we need to develop differently, think about how countries can develop differently. And the type of institutional changes that we're talking about are quite specific. So whereas windows of opportunity are associated to technological changes, techno-economic paradigm shifts, this paradigm shift is different. It has a deadline, and it's explicitly steered by public policy and driven by economic utility functions, but also very much by social value. So this sets it apart. So in terms of this framework, what does all of this mean? If we look at the left-hand side of this figure first, it means that green transformation, per definition, they have new policy priorities. They have deliberately induced technological changes, new supported markets, and so on. And from all of these changes, disruptions are created that can be exploited by firms and sectoral systems in developing countries. But the way these sectoral systems are put together, the type of technologies we're talking about, the actors in the sectoral systems and so on, of course, are key determinants in whether and how such opportunities are exploited. And as a result of this interaction, we might see new catch-up trajectory. This is the hypothesis in terms of technological catch-up and also market catch-up. So in order to try to apply this framework and look into this framework, as I mentioned, our cases are from China, and we are focusing on renewable energy industries. Of course, the green transformation is much wider than that. Many other relevant technologies in terms of energy use or green agricultural processes and so on. But this is our focus. So we had several sectoral case studies of more qualitative nature, and we also had some more quantitative papers using patent analysis and simulation exercises, and so on for more comparative work. And it's brought together in this special issue, and I will give you a link. I will give you these slides. There's a link in the last page if you want to check that out. But basically, we're looking at these sectors, so biomass, concentrated solar power, hydropower, solar PV, and wind power. And I'll be talking about each of these a little bit. But first of all, in terms of sort of the big overall pictures, starting from a working definition, green windows of opportunity as a set of favorable and temporary conditions for long run catching up. We try to look into, to what extent can these changes be traced back to different types of change, and unsurprisingly, we find that indeed institutional policy changes are indeed, when we look at these case histories, the most defining moments, the inflection points can really be traced back to these policy changes as kind of root causes. For all of these sectors, a key moment was in 2006, the renewable energy promotion law in China, but also specific programs like the Golden Sun demonstration program in solar PV, Ride the Wind program in wind power, and so on. What we also find about these windows of opportunity, which is quite different from how windows of opportunity have been discussed in a lot of the literature, is that they are really endogenous. Endogenous to the country, but also endogenous to the kind of processes that we are talking about. And they bring together multiple domains, also something which is different from most other cases. So whereas energy policy is, of course, a key feature of this, the interaction with industrial innovation policy is a fundamental feature. How these initially policy-driven changes in terms of institutions and markets and technologies, how they interact, I think we bring some new evidence about that in this work. So basically, as I mentioned, the nature of the sectoral system is key in sort of defining the trajectories in each of these cases. So, I mean, for all of them, a kind of activity and action in terms of the sectoral systems were important, but it's really also very much more about explaining the nature of trajectories. And if we want to do that, we really have to look at these dynamic interactions between the elements. What we also found is that some issues of technological maturity and tradability of green technologies is also of crucial importance in explaining these trajectories. For many of the cases, there was a kind of, you could call it latecomer effect. So in terms of acquisition of world-class technology, that was facilitated in many cases. So tapping into established pools of technology and sort of adopting that to deploy it was what facilitated development in some of the cases. It was also quite important in terms of support, as I mentioned, not just energy policy, but in terms of innovation policy, investing in public R&D around some of these areas. Very clear, for instance, in the hydro sector, also in other cases. Interactions, I've already mentioned that. But I think what is also important here to mention is that we could see in some cases, one case in particular, a kind of domestic trap where we see fast technological development, China unable to sort of maintain proximity to the global technology frontier, and at the same time inefficient investments, for instance, in such public R&D, and insufficient interactions in the system to maintain such catching up in the wind case, as I will get back to. So basically, we think, as I mentioned, it's quite useful to think about trajectories in terms of this two-dimensional space. On the one hand, a market dimension, on the other hand, a technology dimension. So the market dimension, we looked at that in terms of megawatts installed in the domestic economy and outside in export markets, in terms of sort of the proximity to the global frontier. On the technology dimension, we looked at, on the one hand, new to country technology, on the other hand, new to world technologies. And we made such assessment based on patent analysis and also qualitative assessments. So of course, it's extremely difficult to take such complex trajectories and plot them into the space, but we think it's nevertheless useful to do this. And as is tried to be conveyed in this figure here, you see slightly different routes moving across these quadrants of the different sectors in case. But in sort of identifying some common patterns, we identified 4 different types of trajectories, and these are what I will be talking about now. So the first kind of trajectory, we call that domestic imitation to global leadership. And this was observed in biomass and hydropower. In both of these sectors, we have clear global lead firm status. As I mentioned, this latecomer effect and technology absorption was very important in both cases, with sort of the extra advantage of having quite stable technology. So to some extent, this is a little bit counterintuitive, because some of the theory would say that you have more dynamic opportunities for catching up in more disruptive technologies. But of course, this has to be weighed against the ease of access into mature technologies. The case of biomass, to go into that a little bit, was quite an interesting story. So that was really supported by one firm in particular, who was really the key player. As compared to the other sectors, we cannot identify a case where there was one firm who was really a leader in this and facilitating subsequent development. So one particular biomass company acquired a Danish company, in fact, in biomass, and absorbed technology from there. And what happened in then the sectoral system was that diffusion from that initial company to sort of second-tier companies was facilitated by investments in design institutions that worked as intermediaries, and combined with sort of loose enforcement of intellectual property rights, that created large-scale diffusion. And that diffusion has subsequently been used to expand quite drastically in export markets in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, with Chinese capabilities for sort of organizing and setting up projects overseas. Hydropower, let me be a bit more brief on that. That has, of course, a much older history in China, but still, access to foreign expertise was very important, aided by international programs supported by the World Bank and so on, to develop hydropower in China. Once you saw global market shifts in that sector, when the World Bank stopped actually supporting hydropower globally, there was a kind of space for China to redeploy the capabilities that have been gradually building up, including capabilities to manufacture turbines and so on, and combined with state support and Chinese finance, there was a space for going global, and China is the undisputed global leader in these export markets. Then moving to this other path, domestic imitation with limited global progression. I already mentioned that. The case of wind was also very much a case of technology transfer, but only technology transfer to a certain extent. So it was very efficient in building up sort of base capabilities, but not sufficient capabilities for really making it in the global markets. And the reason for that is the way that industry is sort of developing technologically. We are seeing that basically the sort of center of gravity is not around designing wind turbines, which the Chinese can do perfectly, but it's much more about deploying offshore. It's about smart wind farm management and advanced control system integration into the grid, and some areas where the Chinese still haven't really cracked it. And also an area in which the sort of Chinese state have been not able to really maintain the initial momentum to keep up with technological development. Then we have another interesting case of solar PV. We call it learning from exporting over domestic strengthening to global leadership. So this was really a case initially of Chinese sort of low-cost manufacturing capabilities, exporting in particular to the German market. Once the financial crisis hit, combined with protectionist measure in Europe, there was sort of a block to this export adventure, and that had to be sort of then supported and rearranged with investments in the domestic market, further building up the capabilities, and then there's been now a sort of reorientation again to the global market, and China is by far the largest manufacturer in this sector. In terms of the concentrated solar power sector, that's also quite an interesting sector. So here China has started in a sense from a position of world-class position, but of course due to a lot of technological uncertainty in this sector, there's really limited global market progression, because there's still a lot of a drive to sort of bring the price down to make it comparable with other technologies. And there's no established dominant design yet, so everybody is a little bit uncertain about what to back. But China in this case is really learning and investing at the same time as with leaders in Spain and the US and elsewhere. But nevertheless, I mean, in terms of this premature technology, China is working at the forefront. So just to sort of come back and make a summary of the key insights, the key findings. I've already been over this, but these windows of opportunity, the green windows, are opened in particular by these institutional changes. And we can see this in all the cases of catching up that we've examined here. New policies are really driving this, and they provide the disruption and dynamism that has otherwise in other cases been having other sources. There are very important variations in the trajectories, as I was just describing, but endogeneity of these windows are important. The complementarity between the different elements and the interaction effect really helps to explain how trajectories unfold differently. There's also very clear that this quite successful case or successful cases I've been talking about doesn't sort of come automatically just with investing in renewables deployment, for instance. You have to have very active measures to at the same time enhance technological capabilities. China has been open in terms of technology absorption, at some points also involving global players into the domestic economy, in other times constraining them, being very strategic about this, and doing this in a very sequential and quite thoughtful manner. And this is really what is behind China's position now in these industries. So in terms of policy implications, one thing which is very important is really about the importance of co-designing different policy domains and thinking about them not separately, but in conjunction, something which is not easy to do, but something which is necessary. And beyond that, also having sector-specific approaches to this, because even this kind of co-design cannot look the same in different sectors. They are very much tailored to sort of technological dynamics, as I was just mentioning. One important policy implication here is that the story I've been talking about really has international beneficial effects in terms of reducing the price of energy transition technologies, in terms of mobilizing finance and technology for more affordable and green energy systems in the global south and north. Of course, there's a lot more to be said about this, because that is not just a rosy story. There's lots of contentions and tensions involved in this. But by and large, having China as a global player in the space is speeding up the green transformation. What international policy organizations can do when thinking about this is that they can help to sustain institutional change-led and mission-oriented green windows, facilitating the entry into global markets for new green innovation leaders, for the reasons I've just mentioned, for the reason also of getting a much wider variety of technological solutions, including also solutions that may be more appropriate in less developed countries. Then just in terms of some of the new questions that are rising out of this, the very obvious one, of course, is, okay, China could do this, but to what extent can this also be useful? Can these be useful experiences in other countries? That's some work I would like to do, expanding the kind of focus. And also look at, in terms of when we're thinking about techno-economic paradigm shifts. So how do the green transformation and the sort of digital techno-economic paradigm shift, how do these trends intertwine, and what does it mean? Is it helping advanced economies the most, or is it indeed helping some and creating some opportunities for leapfrogging in places like China, India, South Africa, and beyond? Also, can we use this kind of framing and this kind of discussion that I've been talking about, can we use that to think about even wider global challenge-led windows of opportunity also in other industries such as health, digital infrastructure, and other public good domains important for building an inclusive society? So to what extent can sort of international policy organization help to invest in sort of manufacturing innovation capabilities in conjunction with the supply of public good technologies, in particular in developing countries, and also creating these windows that can be exploited, which of course also means that there will be wider public support for these kinds of processes when the sort of economic gains from this are distributed in a more equal manner. Then I just want to mention, in relation to new questions and new research, that UNCTAD this year, 2021, for the first time introduced this technology and innovation report as an annual report. And next year, 2022, it will be around these kind of issues. So titled Green Windows of Opportunity, Innovation That's Good for the People and the Planet. And I've been involved in some of this process, and the part that I'm involved in, some of the ways that we're extending this research is to look at other cases beyond China, and also look at other technologies, not just renewable energy. We're also trying to look at this in a kind of global value chains perspective. So as we see the greening of global value chains, as changes in environmentally induced changes in final demand, as that transpires down through the GVC to local suppliers in developing countries, what does that mean in terms of constraints or windows of opportunity? And also lastly, as I mentioned, trying to address the relevance of new and emerging technologies for exploiting these opportunities, something which UNCTAD is very interested in. And then, as Antonio was mentioning in the introduction, this is just a kind of commercial advertisement. And we produced this book, which is discussing, in a way, these issues in East Africa and Kenya in particular, not drawing on the concept of green windows explicitly, but really talking about what you could call the economic co-benefits of renewable electrification in Kenya and wider East Africa. So we use that to discuss this also in terms of policy and recommendations and so on. So that book is also available open access. And yeah, this is just an overview of the papers involved in the ICC special issue. That is the last for me. I don't know whether I will be able to share the slides with the participants somehow, but otherwise just you can send me an email. It's here on the screen. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rasmus. Thanks. That was brilliant. You managed to compact quite a lot of things in this presentation, and thanks for the references that I'm sure are going to be helpful for the broader community who is working in this area, which is of course very, very significant, and there are lots of people also at IPP looking at these issues. I will refrain myself from commenting and asking questions. There are many, but let me just pass the floor to Kino and remind everyone that after Kino's initial comments, we will open the floor for further question. You can either use the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can raise your hand and I will invite you to join the panel for asking directly the question. Kino.
Thanks, Antonio. And thanks, Rasmus, for a very great presentation. And I can really invite everyone to look at the entire special issue. I think there are loads of great articles for anyone who's interested in any research sort of on the idea of green growth and windows of opportunity and latecomer development. And hopefully it will sort of contribute to our understanding, moving away from sort of development along the environmental goodness curve and away from this idea, let's develop first and clean up later, to sort of more leapfrogging and really capturing the opportunities. I'm going to try and keep it brief, but I will sort of quickly talk about the main takeaways for me, a few comments, and then one or two questions. I think, yeah, as I said, the article is really great because I think it really gives sort of a good idea of why green windows of opportunity are different from traditional windows of opportunities, and that here the role of institutional change is really what's important. And I think that's quite important for two reasons, because one is it's hopefully can also increase our predictability of these windows of opportunity. And also it really calls for greater government involvement, for industrial policy and all sorts of that. And I think this article advances our understanding of these, as you call, favorable but time-bound conditions that arise from changed institutions, markets, technologies, but that these opportunities can emerge from sort of changes in the prevailing techno-economic paradigm, from changes in market demand, sort of major modifications to government regulations, but also that the sequencing and sort of the interaction of these three is really what's relevant here. And I think I particularly liked sort of the lens of the sectoral innovation system, which analyzes firms and institutions together in one approach rather than one or the two, which I think you often see, that you sort of see this dichotomy of state versus market. Just a few sort of brief comments. I think you mentioned this in the presentation already, but I'd say that at least my understanding of the special issue, most of the focus actually lies on demand side policies. And I think it'd be really interesting to also increase sort of the focus on supply side policies and how they interact and how phasing of that can be important. And sort of, yeah, just more research into the different types of policies that support green windows of opportunities. Of course, you mentioned this already, but sort of the need for research in other countries, because China is a very particular case and it is very large and it's very unique. But as you also argue in the article, that windows of opportunity are also relevant for developed countries. And I think it'd be really interesting to sort of advance the research on that and also understand how incumbents sort of use industrial policies themselves to secure their position and create entry barriers or whatever. And a minor comment on the analytical framework, sort of on this graph that you also showed. I think in the text you actually describe a lot about the sort of interrelated connections and how it, the sectoral system and the institutions also enable the green transformation. And I think the framework could also be more circular, because it's not that the green transition in itself is sort of the starting point, is also that, yeah, the sectoral system and institutions can affect that vice versa, and it can hopefully create this sort of vicious circle. And then maybe, if I may, sort of two brief questions. I think you mentioned this domestic trap already, but I wonder, and of course this depends on the sector, but like, where is the value really being created? Because, as you distinguish between market and technology leadership, and you had this other article from, I think, last year with your colleague, Stina Harkinson, where you discussed the role of knowledge-intensive business services. And I really wonder that, where's the value being captured? Is that still within the developed countries? And is it maybe the market leadership that latecomer countries can capture, but capturing sort of the technology advancement seems to be much harder, maybe also because of entry barriers from the incumbents. And then a second question that is probably more related to my own research interest. You talked a bit about these sort of international beneficial effects, including the reduced cost of energy that these windows of opportunity might sort of bring about. But I also wonder, is understanding how the costs of technology, of energy, are being driven down really key in understanding how to capture the window of opportunity? So almost like a chicken and egg situation, what comes first? But yeah, otherwise I think I'm going to stop here, give you a chance to respond, and then hopefully we can just open up to the floor.
Thanks, Kino. Thanks for these reflections. I still don't see any raised hand, and let me invite people again if they want to use the Q&A function or to raise their hand for joining the discussion. So maybe Rasmus, you can start addressing some of the points, and then when I have some people in the audience, I will start collecting questions as well. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks for these comments. Some really good points to reflect about, including, for instance, this point about the circularity of the conceptual framework. Of course, we know that everything is related to everything, but I haven't really tried to think about systematically, okay, what could be the type of feedback effects as you are alluding to. So that's one interesting thing to think about. And also this point about the increase in predictability, I think is also a really interesting point, because I mean, that is also something which is quite unique when you have endogenous opportunities that you can increase. But what does that really mean in terms of the policy implications of that? Also not something that we have been thinking through in detail. I think I also agree with you that we are much stronger on demand side policies and dynamics than on the supply side. You are absolutely right, and I think, I mean, a part of that at least is because, I mean, we don't have so much new to add. I mean, a lot is already known about the importance of supply side policies for latecomer development, and also in the literature I referred to in relation to exploiting windows of opportunity. What we really have as something new is much closer related to the demand side. But I mean, obviously, I mean, a lot of these supply side initiatives, of course, are a crucial ingredient in this. And of course, that is related to investments in capabilities, investing in incentives for firms to invest themselves in new knowledge development, and so on. And as I mentioned, many of these programs try to build in that component into demonstration project programs, and so on. I think, I mean, the point about value capture is extremely interesting, and also quite complex. And I think one useful way to think about it is that, at least in the first instance, it's about capturing the value of the investments in the green transformations in the first place. So, for instance, there's this paper together with Franco and Antonio, where we're looking at the importance or the role of protectionism, discussing the role of protectionism in here. So of course, if you are investing in very rapid market expansion, you need to make sure that also domestic companies are getting the most out of this expansion, and not some foreign firms coming in and sort of grabbing that value there. So that's at least the first instance. And that is in particular done, for instance, through local content requirements, through sort of more or less clear specifications in terms of auction rounds and contract awards, and so on. Then when we're talking about value capture in the wider sense, then obviously it's difficult, again, in the case of China, to separate exactly the investment in deployment, because in many cases China is also, you know, providing loans, so there's some Chinese money behind that, and of course they also again want to capture the value of those projects that they're doing overseas. But nevertheless, and this is in particular in sort of these very project organized, heavy industry kind of sectors. In other sectors, it's different. But the main point, of course, is that, you know, the learning experiences enabling China to be strong in the solar PV sector, for instance, in export markets, over time enables China to capture that value from the global markets. So. I understand why you are asking this question. And also, I mean, I think in terms of this thing about the paper you mentioned, we were looking at the role of knowledge-intensive business services in transferring knowledge from lead markets, global lead markets in Europe to China. And of course, the advantage they have is that the global lead firms, of course, will not transfer that knowledge, but the knowledge-intensive business services don't have any intrinsic sort of interest in keeping that knowledge. So that's why they are able to do this transfer. And I think in these cases, I mean, the knowledge that is transferred, it really enables China to capture that knowledge. And, you know, for the consultancies, it's just a one-off kind of operation, or I mean, of course there can be repeated interactions, but the long-term value capture after that event really lies in China. And then you had also a question about how this value capture relates to price reductions. Can you just say that again?
No, I mean, basically just like sort of if you think that the understanding of where sort of the drivers of cost reductions, where they come from, if that is really key in order to capture both sort of market and technological leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, to a large extent, the drivers of the cost reduction is, of course, increased learning rates, and also, in particular, for the case of China, economies of scale. So both of these are helping to push down prices, and I mean, that's a good thing for the green transformation. Of course, it creates price reductions, but that's equal for anybody, and then it's just about, you know, who wins the game for capturing this value in a sort of normal competitive way.
Yeah. Of course, this is quite controversial as well, because China had a problem of overcapacity after 7-8 years of support to that. So they've been trying to promote this technology, of course, to export the technology, but in some countries, that technology doesn't deliver in terms of cost price, in terms of unit cost price, as much as more embedded technology that already exists there. Think about hydro, in some countries, gas or other type of. So it's a quite complex environment in a sense. And this question around what justifies certain type of learning curves goes back to the broader picture around, you know, what are the preconditions to capture these windows of opportunities, right? Because there is an element of optimism that support the type of framework, right? There is an idea that, you know, they're being backward, you know, and Abramovich and so on, it's not necessarily a negative thing, but actually you are, you know, in a position to leapfrog and so on. But the distance from the new technology and what you are really capable to do, both technologically and organizationally, might make that jump quite problematic. Maybe we can come back to this issue. I'm curious about your been working for quite some time, both in South Africa and in Tanzania, on the problem related to the absorption of these green opportunities and why these green windows are not open, if you want, they remain closed windows. Maybe we can go back to that later on. I want to invite Olga raised her hand to raise a question, and also there's a long questions in the chat. I will invite also Patricia to join. Please, Olga.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you, Rasmus, very much for inspiring presentation. I think I've heard a lot of hope there, which we all need now to hear after COP26. My question would be about policies and developing countries, and because as I understand, you are arguing that policies are crucial, and you know, obviously they're not abstract, and so they have so much potential to bring in the tech and to sustain those windows of green opportunities. I wonder if we also think of policies not detached from agencies that design those policies. And I think systems of innovation or innovation literature is quite good at doing comparative policy analysis and all that. So if we think of developing countries in the previous techno-economic paradigm, where they remained or they were locked into certain types of policies that did not really help them to develop strong domestic disruptive technologies or to integrate, right, these domestic firms or basically national systems of innovation into the global markets in a way that they would make them equal players. I mean, some did, but only few, right? How can we think in terms of them being capable today to design, experiment, and do that types of policies that would be tailored for disruptive change? Leaving China aside, right? Because they have been, I think, quite good in policy experimentation. So my question would be that, how to incorporate the continuity and of that policy capacity into the message of hope that the study and the paper you have been presenting.
Excellent, Olga. Rasmus, if you think it's a good idea, I'll ask Patricia also to raise a question, and then you will have a chance to go through both of them. Maybe they are also connected, so let's give us an opportunity to do that. Patricia.
Hi, thank you. I think it's exactly my comments on the chat that Olga has repeated. I think she's reframed it differently. It's exactly the same points that I have raised there. And really it's about, again, asking those in and when I look at the developing country, when I refer to them, I always refer to the global south, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, seeing that they're so behind. And again, similar to what Olga talked about, previously, what I call the last fad, as it was, you know, everybody must follow the neoclassical policies and employ that for development, and that hasn't helped them. And now this has also been introduced, and then they have huge reserves of fossil fuels, which is cheaper. They would really be it would be really, you know, possibly difficult for them to actually leapfrog, you know, because the capability for innovating in green technology resides elsewhere. And it would mean also they will continue to rely on the global north for those technologies, just like when the mass manufacturing phase happened, and still, you know, in terms of trade and so many other things. So that's it. I think that it's not prescriptive for the global south, and especially for those developing poor countries. I think it's probably it's maybe using some of those opportunities as toolboxes and finding different solutions that are relevant to different stages of development, rather than saying discard everything and follow this, do what I'm doing now. They can't necessarily do what you're doing now because they're still struggling, you know, and they're still far behind in terms of development. So,
thanks,
yeah.
That's great, thanks. So we have a cluster of questions here that it's pretty much you know, asking you to, you know, given the interest in the framework and so on, in going deeper into some discussion. Of course, Patricia is looking at also, it's another of our PhD students from the Nigerian experience, and of course, broader sub-Saharan African case. And I guess the problem is, you know, let me be provocative, you know, China has managed to get to this point after a significant phase of deep industrialization, right? And integration in value chain and controlling of this technology. So what about the rest? What about countries who are now trying to enter into this space?
Yeah, I think in a way, all three comments, this comment now and your initial point about overcapacity, Olga's comments and Patricia's, I think are somehow related. And I mean, we are moving a little bit out of the Chinese GWO discussion and into issues around that book that I showed just before. I mean, first of all, the point about overcapacity, I think this is very much true in the case of solar PV. I think it's much less true in some of the other sectors, at least if we think about sort of overcapacity in the traditional sense. There might also be some overcapacity in the financial sphere that also have very important implications. But let me try to address this in terms of the message of hope. I completely agree with the basic sentiment of this point, and also about the sort of the relationships with issues around institutional capacity and so on. Absolutely true. I think basically the point of departure for an expanded message of hope somehow is that in these cases, there are some arguments that will be more sort of resonant with the global policymakers around why we should do things differently than what we have done before, why we should also use different kinds of tools than we have done before, that also connects to Patricia's point about the sort of political underpinnings of this. But when it comes to the green transformation, there's a sort of extended legitimacy of what we would otherwise call sort of heterodox policy initiatives. I think that is one element of the message of hope. I think another message of hope is also that, of course, it's very slow in terms of convincing the global community and people in positions of power of the fact that if we really want to sustain the green transformation globally, which everybody agrees is necessary, then we do have to share the benefits, the economic benefits that are associated with the green transformation. If that doesn't happen, the legitimacy is undermined, and this recognition, I think, is slowly being sort of adopted. And that also means that we do have to think about, like we were talking about co-designing of policies in China, it also means we have to think about co-designing of policies globally. So it has implications for what you are allowed to do, explicitly or implicitly in terms of policy in the WTO domain, the trade domain, and think about that in conjunction with the green transformation and so on. In particular, I mentioned this issue about local content requirements. Of course, when China did this, then everybody is saying, okay, we are now going to sue you. And by the time China is reacting to this, then the problem has gone away, because then, as it moves down, China has already removed them. And then in the second iteration, China itself is becoming increasingly concerned with other countries' local content requirements and other countries' enforcement of intellectual property rights, and so on. But I think, this recognition that the gains have to be distributed in a much more fair way, it means that in case of the sub-Saharan African context, we absolutely should allow local content requirements to be enforced, and enforced in a very effective way. And we know that if that is going to be useful, then it has to be designed in a quite intelligent and dynamic way. And in order to do that, you need institutional capacity to enforce it. And for that, we need to invest much more in capacity building, in partnerships between energy agencies in Europe and energy agencies in sub-Saharan Africa and so on, in a way which is non-competitive, because for this element here, it's non-competitive, and we also have to get these kinds of players on board in order to try to make the arguments a bit more widely heard, and also make, for instance, European domestic companies understand these issues. I can see you have raised again, Patricia. Let's try to have a bit more interactive discussion.
I think there are no other questions coming in. I guess maybe we can go also on some specific cases. I mean, I would be interested in hearing a bit more about, the book seems to focus on Kenya and some opportunities there. Of course, one of the big players in the COP26 was how South Africa is or not managing that type of transition. And here we're working quite a lot with the Presidential Climate Commission and other players in the context there. And if anyone has been following the discussion at the moment, it's not so clear what is the pathway, right? There has been a big win in terms of getting a significant financial streams that is supposed to unlock a otherwise completely compromised state-owned ESCOM, the main player. But at the same time, the Ministry of Energy is, addressing a fundamental political economy issue, which is the fact that there are lots of incumbent players and interest, and also in the broader population of people that might actually find difficult to digested type of transition. So I would talk about not just how do we share the benefit, but how do we share the cost of the transition. And the cost of the transition in the long term, we are going all to win about this, but who is going to be part of that process of actually supporting the cost that is associated with that at the very local level, right? This is in the East African region, if we look at the different strategy that countries have followed, and also in relation to China and the penetration of financing in construction of coal plants or other type of plants or hydro. Ethiopia is probably an outlier in terms of how they fund their own energy system restructuring around a big dam on the Nile, but Tanzania is still struggling significant after 20 years of significant corruption in that kind of sector, and that corruption has also created a quite fragile system in terms of the TANESCO and the public management of that. Nigeria has a big elephant in the room, which is an economy which is basically running around the rent associated with oil. So how do we unpack that as well, right? So maybe, Patricia, if you want to complement that, because I know you work on Nigeria, but in general, if we start looking at some specific cases and you could share some lessons from the book, would be actually very interesting to hear. Patricia, sorry, I didn't want to block you before. You had your raised hand, so please join us.
Okay, thank you. I think a lot of the points you've raised them. The point I wanted to introduce, and I had made that point earlier, is the fact that what is Africa expected to do, or countries like Nigeria who have huge reserves of this fossil fuel, what are we expected to do with it? That's one. Secondly, there's a school of thought that if the global north still had, and that's why America is not really so strong there, because nobody is dictating to them what to do, because they have fossils, they have huge reserves. So if global north still had that, would that still be the same body language? Thirdly, China's case is very unique. They were able to close everyone out and do their own thing at their own pace. So who is now dictating, and who is policing, and is it in anyone's position to police what any other country or any other region should be doing with what they have? So those are some of the elephants in the room in terms of conversations that are not being had. Yes, some of these countries will take funding and do mini projects and say they support green transition. But in reality, it's a sustainable thing. Are they ready for it? Is their market advanced and mature enough to embark on that? Because there's some major fundamental things that are still going on in terms of poverty issues and so many other things that need to be resolved. And this is not their priority at this time.
Rasmus, please. I think we will put quite a lot on the table here. So
yeah. Many things. I mean, I don't want to overstate my degree of optimism. Certainly not. This is sort of there's no shortcuts. It's extremely difficult to do these things, as Olga also pointed out, in particular in the context of Africa, not just because of the difficulty of designing and implementing policies combined with issues of corruption and so on, but also because you need a base of industrial development capacity, as Antonio also just mentioned. And I mean, for the case of Nigeria and the oil point, I mean, in principle, there are many obstacles to this. In principle, I would stand by Nigeria's claim for saying, okay, we are embedded with oil for the moment. And of course, if it's not, of course, happening sufficiently as it is now, but in principle, using that as a kind of a springboard for green transitions. This has been done in Norway, that also had a lot of oil and gas reserves. using that experience to, of course, develop the economy, and right now is in the process of using the capabilities from the oil and gas sector to expand into green sectors, including offshore wind and so on. So there's a kind of a capability expansion there, and this is why I would say for the case of Nigeria, I mean, first things first, before expanding into this, or rather, I mean, subsequently with doing these things. Let me, I don't know where to start. I mean, in terms of bringing out a little bit of the material from some of the Kenyan cases. There's so much to address here, but let me say that if you read that book, there is also a degree of optimism, but there's also much more attention given to why this is so extremely difficult to do, including also the problem, not just the benefit of having China in the global economy. So for instance, when it comes to the solar PV industries, no one is going to compete with China in manufacturing of complete solar PV panels. That's almost impossible to do, and will be impossible, at least for as far as I can see into the future here. So the opportunities for sort of value capture and learning are really in other elements of solar PV deployment than actual manufacturing of solar PV. And of course, the extent of value capture there is much less. The learning opportunities are also much more constrained. But nevertheless, there are things to learn from the process of deploying solar PV, and there are also some very limited opportunities for engaging in some kind of a local assembly and so on. So these are some of the issues that we go into. We also go into the Chinese case in another sense, which is about the sort of what we could call, in this case, when we have a Chinese finance, we also have foreign content requirements. And that means that, you know, gaining a share of that value, gaining a foothold in the value chain for the local companies is extremely difficult for this case. And what we, of course, again, find is that you have to be very deliberate about planning such type of projects, because in many cases, you have deals being done in a very ad hoc way. So a Chinese delegation shows up in the ministry and they say, okay, we have an opportunity for providing a huge loan and making this project. What do you say? And in that kind of context, the bargaining power between buyers and suppliers of green technology is extremely skewed. So you have to be much more systematic and open and transparent in evaluating different kind of proposals for energy projects. And you have to be extremely strategic about embedding into sort of the arrangements around the deal that we want this a share of the local supply chain. We do want also learning experience and knowledge transfer. And we do want to have some of our key institutions closely involved also for learning. And one of the reasons for also an added element of difficulty is that, you know, these in many cases are huge projects and they're only done ever so many years. So that experience of implementing one kind of project and transferring it to another, or even transferring it to another kind of infrastructure setting is difficult. In Ethiopia, they have been quite clever in doing this, getting institutions on board that can be a kind of knowledge repository and making sure that these experiences are transferred to subsequent projects. I can see there's a hand up in the chat.
Yes, we can invite Oscar to join with a question. Oscar, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you. We cannot see you,
Okay,
but we can hear you well.
I don't know if I can. Can I turn on my video? Can you see me?
You should be able to. If not, don't worry. It's fine.
Okay, never mind. We got the sound. Thank you, Rasmus. Fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed it, and I'm can't wait to read the paper in full. I have a question about the future, because and we obviously need to understand the future by understanding the past. So I think this is a tremendous contribution for doing so. And in Denmark, I'm Danish as well, there's much hype around electrofuels, as I'm sure you're well aware, and also carbon capture and storage. And I wonder how you perceive, and I could add also other kinds of long-term storage technologies, which I do think is a bit under prioritized. But I wonder how you see these new technology spaces that are opening up, that are being envisioned, and how you see them through your green windows of opportunity lens here. Is there something particular in these spaces where you see some potential for developing countries to catch up? Yes, cheers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a way really not an expert in these new technologies of power to X, and I mean carbon capture and storage. For the first one and the entire hydrogen economy, I think there's some really interesting prospects there. I mean, I think the sort of knowledge base underwriting these technologies are extremely advanced. So it's actually much easier to gain a foothold in the wind industry, in particular in small wind and so on, in hydrogen-based industries. And we're talking about an advanced knowledge base and many systemic complexities around that makes it quite challenging. But the interesting thing about this is that the sort of limits to this discussion that we're having, and also in relation to the issue of value capture, is that the point of production and consumption of energy is really tied to each other. So co-location is a limit in this sense. And the reason why some Northern African countries, for instance, are very excited about the hydrogen economy is with the prospects that they can, of course, use the natural resources, the sun basically, to store this energy and then transport it to export markets over wide distances. So for this reason, at least I think that technology is quite interesting. And also in combination with, for instance, concentrated solar power, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, there's many synergies between these technology fields that could be quite interesting. I mean, I know also that Namibia is thinking very much along these lines, also as a supplier to South Africa. I don't think it's going to solve all the problems that Eskom has. But they're thinking about, having at least a contribution to solving some of the problems. Yeah, let me stop here.
Indeed, I mean, lots of these energy issues in Africa are also regional issues, right? So to a certain extent, the current discussion on, of course, the use of gas and in Mozambique, in Tanzania, and what that would mean for Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, and all the other countries, and the integration, of course, the South African energy system is fully integrated into the SADC and Namibia kind of context. So, in a sense, this makes things even more political and complicated, right? Because the political economy we are used to is a political economy where fundamentally there were rents positions that were created over the years, and it's difficult to unpack them because they're long-term investment. In many cases, foreign companies were actually gaining out of this rents position, right? So in a sense, the foreign, I like the expression foreign content policy, it's pretty much good practice in big business, right? As much as China is doing. So there is a big emphasis on how China does that. But if you look at the big multinational companies who are operating in the space of the energy, oil and gas and so on, of course, they are pretty much retaining this capability. And this is happening as part of the political economy of the engagement with that, right? So it's not just a north-south, it's what has happened within the political economy of the South that has made this possible. So it's not a simple colonialist argument, it's actually how the colonialist past and the current evolution in lack of industrialization in these countries has made possible to have these quite bad deals around energy. And so to a certain extent, we are just touching the surface of this discussion. And I think it's also interesting that would be interesting to see what countries like Brazil, for example, where the state has retained capacity, Petrobras and big oil company, if they're going to do that type of related diversification, right, in terms of offshore wind or other type of, using their capacity in offshore drilling and so on. Probably the situation in Africa is more complex than that. We're a bit behind, and probably we go back to this point that countries who have managed to industrialize are in a much better position to deal with the problem of green transition, paradoxically. And I think there's been too much emphasis on I'm curious about the Kenix. I haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but we did a project a few years back in Tanzania looking at working with some companies in the sisal industry to understand how they were managing their energy and trying to model different type of use of biomass, vis-a-vis wind, vis-a-vis solar. And the reason why we did that, we published a piece in energy policy, was because there is so much emphasis on energy for consumption uses. But when it comes energy for productive uses, the picture becomes more complicated, right? Because not all the same type of activities require the same type of energy. The grid is not there, or is very fragile, and what that means for scaling up industrialization. So turning the equation the other way around, which is, are we leapfrogging too early in the sense of before actually we are even able to walk into the industrialization path, right? And what that implies for countries who are really behind in that. So I think this is a fascinating conversation to continue. Without further ado, I think we are running out of our time. Thanks so much, Erasmus, for sharing with us so many interesting insights from all these different projects. And we look forward to continue the conversation in the coming weeks and months. Thanks so much for that. And thanks everyone for joining.
Great pleasure. And thanks for all the excellent comments. I've gotten a lot of interesting things to think about.
Excellent. We will keep.
Thanks, Erasmus.
Thanks, everyone.